The town of Larkspur Creek had never seen a man ride in with a coffin lashed to his saddle, and a woman's name breaking from his lips like a prayer he could not stop saying. But on the third Tuesday of April in the year 1878, that was exactly what happened. Perry Yates came down the dusty Main Street at a slow walk, his black gelding lathered white at the neck, and behind the saddle, tied fast with rawhide cord across two crude wooden rails, rode a pine box scarred from 3 days beneath an unforgiving sun. Dust clung to Perry's coat and hat brim, and his eyes, pale gray and rimmed red from grief and lack of sleep, moved over the false-fronted buildings of Larkspur Creek as though searching for something he was both desperate to find and terrified of finding. "Hazel Hurst," he said again, the way he had said it for the better part of 40 miles, as if repeating her name enough times might soften whatever blow was coming when he finally spoke it aloud to the woman herself. "Hazel Hurst. Where is Hazel Hurst?" Women on the boardwalk drew their children close. Men stepped out from the mercantile and the blacksmith's shop, wiping their hands on their aprons, watching the stranger with the coffin the way folks in a cattle town watch an approaching storm, uncertain whether to run for shelter or stand and see what it brings. A dog barked twice and then fell silent, as if even the animals of Larkspur Creek understood that something solemn had arrived among them. Sheriff Wade Calloway stepped off the porch of his little clapboard office, one hand resting easy near the walnut grip of his revolver, though there was no menace in the man riding toward him, only a hollowed-out kind of sorrow that Calloway, who had buried 2 wives and a son of his own, recognized at 50 paces. "Hold up there, stranger," Calloway called, though not unkindly. "You are drawing quite a crowd." Perry reined in his horse before the sheriff's office, and for a moment he simply sat there, swaying slightly in the saddle from exhaustion, his hands trembling on the reins. "I am looking for a woman," he said, his voice cracking like dry leather. "Her name is Hazel Hurst. She came west from Ohio some 2 months back by arrangement to marry a man named Thomas Yates." A murmur went through the gathering crowd, for many in Larkspur Creek knew that name. Thomas Yates had bought 160 acres along the creek bend not a year before, had built himself a soddy and then a proper frame house with his own 2 hands, and had written to a matrimonial paper back east for a bride, as more than a few lonesome men in that country had done. The whole town had known Hazel Hurst was expected, had known the wedding was to be held that very week at the little clapboard church on the hill. "I know Hazel Hurst," Calloway said slowly, his eyes drifting from Perry's face down to the coffin strapped behind him, and understanding began to dawn in the old lawman's weathered features. "You are kin to Thomas Yates." "His brother," Perry said. "Perry Yates." He drew a breath that shuddered on its way out of him. "Sheriff, I would be grateful if you could tell me where I might find Miss Hurst, before this town's gossip beats me to the telling of it." Calloway's jaw tightened, and he glanced once more at the coffin, and something passed between the 2 men that needed no words. "She is boarding with Widow Coyle, 2 streets over, past the mercantile." Abigail Coyle's place, the yellow house with the white fence. He paused. "Son, I am sorry for what has befallen your brother. Thomas was a good man. This town thought well of him." "He was the best of us," Perry said quietly, and then he clicked his tongue to the gelding and rode on, the coffin creaking softly behind him with every step, and the whole of Larkspur Creek fell in behind him at a respectful distance, drawn by that particular hunger that small towns have for tragedy that is not their own, though there was kindness in most of those following faces too, and worry, and a great deal of dread for the woman who did not yet know what waited for her. Hazel Hurst was standing in Abigail Coyle's garden when she heard the commotion rising from the street, hanging wet linens on a line strung between 2 cottonwood trees, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a wooden clothespin held between her teeth. She was 22 years old, with hair the color of ripe wheat pulled back beneath a faded blue bonnet, and eyes the deep green of prairie grass after spring rain. She had come west with 2 trunks and a heart full of careful, guarded hope, the kind of hope A woman learns to hold gently when she has already lost her mother to fever and her father to a mining accident in the hills of southern Ohio, and had nothing left there to keep her. She had exchanged 11 letters with Thomas Yates over the course of 8 months. She had memorized the careful, plain script of his hand, the way he described the creek that ran silver bright past his land in the mornings, the way he spoke of wanting a partner in life rather than merely a housekeeper, the small jokes he made about his own cooking, which he admitted was terrible. She had fallen a little in love with him through paper and ink before ever laying eyes on his face, and though she had only known him in person for the 11 days since her arrival, she had begun to believe that perhaps this leap she had taken, this desperate crossing of half a continent to marry a stranger, might yet prove to be the finest decision of her life. The wedding had been set for Saturday. She heard Abigail Coyle's voice calling her name from the porch, tight with something Hazel had never heard in the widow's tone before, and she dropped the clothespin into the grass and hurried around the side of the house, wiping her damp hands on her apron. And there in the street before the little yellow house sat a stranger on a lathered black horse, and behind him, unmistakable even from 30 paces, rode a Coffin. Hazel's feet stopped moving of their own accord. The linen she had just hung snapped once in the wind behind her, a sound like a gunshot in the sudden silence of her own mind. "No," she said, though no one had told her anything yet. "No, that cannot be." Perry Yates dismounted slowly, his knees nearly buckling beneath him from 3 days in the saddle, and he removed his hat and held it against his chest. And even before he spoke, Hazel understood everything, the way a body sometimes understands a truth before the mind is willing to accept it, and she felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "Miss Hurst," Perry said, his voice barely above a whisper now, all the desperate calling of her name along the trail spent, leaving only this quiet, terrible moment. "My name is Perry Yates. I am Thomas's brother." "Where is he?" Hazel said, though she already knew, though the Coffin sat not 15 feet from her, gleaming dully in the afternoon sun, and yet some part of her still needed the words spoken aloud, needed the final door closed with sound rather than silence. "He is gone, Miss Hurst," Perry said. "We were 3 days out from Cheyenne, driving a small string of horses down to sell, when we were set upon by men looking to steal the stock. Thomas fought them off. He saved my life and the lives of 2 other men riding with us. But he took a bullet doing it, and though we got him to a doctor within the day, the wound had gone bad by the time we arrived, and there was nothing to be done." Perry's voice broke on the final words, and he pressed his lips together hard, fighting for composure in front of this stranger and this town of strangers, because his brother had asked one thing of him in those final hours, and Perry meant to see it done properly even if it broke him to do it. "He asked me to come find you himself. He made me promise. His very last words, Miss Hurst, were your name." Hazel Hurst did not scream, and she did not faint, though later she would tell Perry that she remembered very little of the next several minutes beyond the strange sensation of the world narrowing to a single point of light, as though she were looking at everything through the wrong end of a spyglass. Abigail Coyle caught her by the elbow as her knees went soft, and half carried, half walked her to the porch steps, and eased her down onto the wood, and Hazel sat there with her hands pressed flat against her own chest as though she might hold her heart together by force if it tried to come apart. "I am sorry," Perry said, standing awkward and helpless in the street, hat still clutched to his chest, the whole town watching this raw and terrible grief unfold before them. "I did not know how else to do this except to come and tell you plain. I did not think it right that you should wait at that church on Saturday for a man who was never coming." "You brought him," Hazel said finally, lifting her face to look at the Coffin, and something in her voice cracked wide open. "You brought him all this way." "I could not leave him buried out on the trail in some nameless place," Perry said. "He deserved better than that. He deserved to rest on the land he built, near the creek he loved so well, and I mean to see that done, Miss Hurst, whatever else comes of it." It was Reverend Elijah Marsh who came forward then, a thin, kindly man with spectacles perched low on his nose, and he laid a gentle hand on Perry's shoulder. "We will see him properly buried, son. You have done a hard and honorable thing, bringing him home." He turned to Hazel, who still sat on the porch steps with her hands pressed to her chest, tears now falling freely and silently down her cheeks. "Miss Hurst, is there anything you need? Anyone we ought to send for?" "There is no one," Hazel said, and the words came out hollow, for she had already told the town this once before, when she first arrived and was asked about family. Her mother dead of fever 11 years past. Her father dead in the mining collapse 3 years back. A married sister in Illinois with 6 children of her own and no room nor means to take in a widowed almost bride. Hazel Hurst had crossed half a continent to marry a man she had known through paper and ink, believing she was building toward a life, and now that life lay in a pine box in the middle of the street, and she had nowhere else in all the world to go. Abigail Coyle, God bless her soft and generous heart, put her arm around Hazel's shoulders and held her there on the porch steps as the whole town looked on, some with tears in their own eyes, for Thomas Yates had been well liked, and there is nothing that stirs a frontier town's sympathy quite like a young bride widowed before she was ever wed. "You will stay with me as long as you need," Abigail said firmly. "That is settled, and there will be no arguing about it." Perry Yates stood in the street a while longer, watching this woman he had traveled 4 days to find, this woman whose name his brother had spoken with such tenderness in the last hours of his life, and something shifted in his chest that he did not yet have a name for, something separate from grief, though tangled up with it so thoroughly that he could not have said where one ended and the other began. He only knew that he could not simply deliver his brother's body and his brother's terrible news, and then ride away and leave this woman to face such sorrow alone in a town full of strangers. "I will see to the arrangements," Perry said quietly to Reverend Marsh. "The funeral, the digging, whatever needs doing. It is the least I can do for him." They buried Thomas Yates 2 days later on a rise of land above the creek that bore his name in the town's memory now, though it had never officially been called that, a gentle slope where wild columbine grew purple and yellow among the grass, with a view down over the 160 acres he had claimed and cleared and built upon with such patient hope. Nearly the whole of Larkspur Creek turned out for the service, for that was the way of such towns, where every death touched every family in some fashion, where a stranger's grief became, for an afternoon at least, the whole community's grief to share and to carry. Hazel stood at the graveside in a borrowed black dress, for she had brought no mourning clothes with her from Ohio, having packed only for a wedding and a new life, not for a burial. Perry stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through her grief-numbed haze, and when Reverend Marsh spoke the words of committal, and the first shovelful of earth struck the coffin lid with a sound like the closing of a great book, Hazel's knees buckled once more. And this time it was Perry's arm that caught her, steady and sure, and she did not pull away from it. "I am sorry," she whispered to him, not knowing quite why she was apologizing, except that grief sometimes makes a person feel they owe the world an accounting for every weakness. "I only knew him 11 days in the flesh. You knew him your whole life. I have no right to grieve so hard when it is you who has lost a brother. Grief is not a thing that keeps accounts, Miss Hurst," Perry said softly, still holding her steady. "You lost a future. That is its own kind of death, and no smaller for being different from mine." They stood together at the grave long after most of the town had drifted back down the hill towards supper and evening chores, until only the two of them and Reverend Marsh remained, and the sun began its long slide toward the western hills, painting the grass gold and the fresh-turned earth a deep, rich brown. "What will you do now, Miss Hurst?" Perry asked finally, as they began the slow walk back down toward town. "I do not rightly know," Hazel admitted. "I have no home to return to. My sister has no room for me. I suppose I shall have to find work here in Larkspur Creek if the town will have me, though I confess I do not know what I am fit for beyond keeping a house and tending a garden and doing fine needlework." The land is still there, Perry said carefully. Thomas's land, his claim. He filed proper under the Homestead Act, and the house is built, and the well is dug, and the fields are cleared for planting. It seems a hard waste to let it go fallow when so much of the labor is already done. It was never my land, Hazel said. I was never his wife. I have no claim to it at all. No, Perry agreed slowly, but I do. I am his only living kin, and by law his claim passes to me now that he is gone. He hesitated, glancing sideways at her, weighing whether what he meant to say next was wisdom or foolishness, and deciding in the end that his brother would have wanted him to say it regardless. I had thought, before I ever left Cheyenne with his coffin, that I would come here, see him properly laid to rest, and then decide what to do with the land. I have some money saved from years of driving cattle and breaking horses. I could work that claim myself, make something of what he started. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. I would not ask you to stay out of charity, Miss Hurst, nor out of any obligation you do not feel. But if you wished it, there might be honest work for you in Larkspur Creek that does not require you to leave the very place your future was meant to be built. Hazel studied him for a long moment in the fading light, this man with his brother's same square jaw and the same steady gray eyes, though there was something gentler in Perry's face, something that had not yet been hardened by whatever years and losses had shaped Thomas before she ever knew him. What sort of work do you mean? Widow Coyle takes in boarders and does washing for half the bachelors in this town, Perry said. She is not young, and her hands trouble her something fierce in the cold months, or so I have heard already from 3 separate strangers since I arrived here 2 days past, this town being what it is for gossip. I expect she could use a partner in that work, someone to help with the cooking and the laundering and the mending. It would not be grand work, Miss Hurst, but it would be honest, and it would let you build a life here if that is what you wished, rather than being cast off to wherever the next stagecoach happened to be heading. It was not romance, not yet, not anything close to it, only 2 grieving strangers standing on a dusty road at dusk trying to find some path forward through a tragedy neither of them had asked for. But Hazel felt something in Perry Yates' careful, halting kindness that steadied her in a way nothing else had since the moment she first saw that coffin strapped behind his saddle. I will speak with Widow Coyle, Hazel said. Thank you, Mr. Yates. Perry, he said. There is no cause for such formality between us now, given all that has passed. Perry, then, Hazel said, and something in the way she said his name, testing its shape in her mouth for the first time, made his chest tighten with an emotion he still refused to examine too closely. Not so soon after burying his brother, not with this woman's grief so raw and fresh. The weeks that followed settled into a strange and careful rhythm. Perry took up residence at Thomas's homestead, sleeping in the small frame house his brother had built, working the fields alone from dawn until dusk, for spring planting waits for no man's grief, and the corn and wheat needed to go into the ground whether or not his heart was in the labor. Hazel moved her 2 trunks fully into Abigail Coyle's spare room, and began rising before dawn each morning to help with the washing and the baking and the mending, her hands finding a kind of solace in honest work that her mind, still raw with loss, could not otherwise find. They saw one another perhaps twice a week at first, when Perry came into town for supplies at the mercantile, or when Hazel walked up to the little cemetery on the hill to lay fresh wildflowers on Thomas's grave, a ritual she kept faithfully every Sunday afternoon regardless of weather. More often than not, she would find Perry already there, or he would arrive shortly after, and they would stand together at the graveside in a silence that gradually grew less painful and more companionable with each passing week, 2 people bound together by a loss that belonged equally to both of them, and yet uniquely to each. It was on one such Sunday, some 5 weeks after the burial, that Perry first spoke to Hazel about the letters. He used to read them to me, Perry said, staring down at the grass now growing thick and green over the grave, softening its raw edges into something more peaceful. Your letters. We would make camp of an evening, out on the range with the horses, and Thomas would take your latest letter from his coat pocket and read it aloud by the firelight, over and over sometimes, until I believe he had near memorized every word of it. Hazel felt her cheeks warm despite the solemnity of the moment. I did not know that. He was proud of you before he ever laid eyes on you, Perry continued. He used to say that any woman who could write with such wit and such warmth about matters as plain as weather and chores and homesickness must have a rare and generous soul. He said he counted himself the luckiest man in the territory to have found you through nothing more than a scrap of newspaper and a leap of faith. Perry paused, and something in his voice grew rougher, more hesitant. I confess, Miss Hurst, that hearing those letters read aloud so many times, across so many long nights on the trail, I came to feel I knew something of you myself before ever we met. It is a strange thing to admit, given the circumstances, and I do not say it to trouble you, only that I would not have you think I came here as a total stranger. In some fashion, I feel I have known you for months. Hazel did not know quite what to say to this confession, and for a long moment the only sound was the wind moving through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere beyond the ridge. I am glad, she said finally, that some good came of those letters, even if the good was not the one I intended when I wrote them. Was there truly nothing left for you back in Ohio? Perry asked, changing the subject as though he too felt he had ventured onto ground too tender to walk further upon just yet. No sweetheart, no family beyond your sister. Nothing, Hazel said. My mother passed when I was 11. My father raised me alone after that, working the coal seams outside our town, until a shaft collapse took him 3 years ago. I kept house for a time with my aunt, but she remarried and her new husband made it plain there was no room in his house for another man's grown niece. I saw the advertisement in the matrimonial paper, and Thomas's letter was the kindest and most honest of the 4 I received in response to my own advertisement, and so I wrote back to him, and here I am. She gave a small, sad laugh, though I confess this is not quite the ending I had imagined for myself when I boarded that train in Ohio. No, Perry agreed quietly. Nor the ending I imagined when Thomas and I set out with those horses. Life has a hard way of rearranging our plans without so much as a by your leave. They stood together a while longer in comfortable silence before Perry offered to walk her back down to town, and as they walked, side by side beneath a sky beginning to purple with the coming evening, Hazel found herself stealing glances at his profile, at the careful, quiet strength in his bearing, and feeling something stir in her chest that she quickly and firmly told herself was nothing more than gratitude for a kind man's friendship in a difficult season of her life. She was not ready, not so soon, to call it by any other name. It was perhaps 2 months after the burial, with early summer settling warm and golden over the plains, when the town of Larkspur Creek held its annual Founders' Dance in the barn behind the Grange Hall, an event that drew ranchers and farmers and townsfolk alike from 20 miles in every direction, with fiddle music and lantern light and long tables groaning under the weight of pies and cured hams and fresh-baked bread. Abigail Coyle insisted that Hazel attend, arguing that a young woman could not spend the whole of her life in mourning clothes and quiet grief, that Thomas himself, kind as he had been, would not have wished such a fate upon her. Hazel wore a dress of pale green calico that Abigail helped her sew from fabric purchased at the mercantile, and when she arrived at the barn that evening, her hair loosely pinned and a few wildflowers tucked behind one ear, she caught sight of Perry Yates standing near the refreshment table in a clean white shirt and a dark vest, looking, for the first time since she had known him, less like a man carrying the weight of the world upon his shoulders, and more like a young man of 26 with his whole life yet ahead of him. Their eyes met across the crowded barn, and something passed between them, warm and startled and a little bit frightened, and Perry crossed the floor to her before she had even fully removed her shawl. "Miss Hurst," he said, and then, correcting himself with a small, shy smile, "Hazel, "You look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Perry," she said, and found that she meant it when she added, "You look well yourself." Quite unlike a man who has spent the last 2 months wrestling stubborn soil into submission. "I scrubbed extra hard for the occasion," he admitted, and they both laughed, and it was the first time Hazel had truly laughed since arriving in Larkspur Creek, a sound that surprised her with how good it felt in her own throat. The fiddler struck up a lively reel, and couples began forming lines across the barn floor, and Perry, with a boldness that surprised even himself, extended his hand toward her. "Would you do me the honor, Miss Hurst? I promise I am not nearly so clumsy on a dance floor as I am behind a plow." Hazel hesitated only a moment, some small voice inside her whispering that it was too soon, that it was somehow disloyal to Thomas's memory to laugh and dance with his own brother scarcely 2 months after burying him. But then she looked into Perry's steady gray eyes and saw nothing there but genuine warmth and a shared understanding of grief, and she placed her hand in his. "I would like that very much," she said. They danced 3 times that evening, and between dances they sat together on a hay bale near the open barn doors, sharing a slice of Abigail Coyle's famous dried apple pie from a single tin plate, talking of small things, of the calf that had been born breech on the Hendricks ranch that week, of the new schoolteacher who had arrived from Missouri, of the wildflowers that were beginning to bloom thick and purple along the creek bank near Thomas's grave. It was, Hazel thought later that night as she lay awake in her narrow bed at Abigail Coyle's house, the first genuinely happy evening she had spent since her arrival in the Territory, and the guilt of that happiness sat heavy and confused in her chest, even as the memory of Perry's warm hand at her waist during the final waltz lingered pleasantly in her mind. She was not the only one lying awake that night turning such thoughts over. Perry Yates rode back out to the homestead beneath a sky thick with stars, and as his horse picked its way along the familiar trail, he found himself thinking not of the crops he needed to tend the next morning, nor of the fences that wanted mending, but of the particular sound of Hazel Hurst's laughter, and the way her green eyes had crinkled at the corners when he made his small joke about scrubbing extra hard, and he felt a guilt of his own settle over him like a wet blanket, for how could he, Thomas's own brother, allow himself to feel such things for the woman his brother had loved and lost? He thought of Thomas often in those days, of the stories his brother had told around countless campfires, of the particular tenderness in Thomas's voice whenever he read Hazel's letters aloud. Perry had loved his brother fiercely, had followed him west from their family's failing farm in Missouri 2 years before, had trusted Thomas's judgment in all things practical and many things personal besides. It felt, in the quiet dark of his own thoughts, like a kind of betrayal to imagine building something with the woman Thomas had chosen for himself, even though Thomas was gone, even though nothing remained of that intended union but grief and a lonely grave on the hillside. And yet Perry could not deny what he felt growing in his chest each time he saw Hazel Hurst, could not pretend that his heart did not quicken at the sight of her, could not convince himself that what passed between them was merely the ordinary comfort of two people who shared a sorrow. It was something more than that, something he suspected Hazel felt too, judging by the careful way she sometimes looked at him and then quickly looked away, as though catching herself in some small transgression. He resolved, that night beneath the wide Wyoming stars, to give it time for the grief to settle into something more bearable, time for both of them to know their own hearts more clearly before either dared speak of what might be growing between them. Thomas deserved that much respect, Perry told himself, and Hazel deserved a courtship built on something more solid than shared mourning and convenient proximity. But time, as it so often does in that hard and beautiful country, had other plans. It was near the end of June when trouble came riding back into Perry Yates' life in the form of Silas Crane, the very man whose gang had ambushed Thomas and Perry on the trail those months before, the man whose bullet had ultimately taken Thomas's life. Crane had escaped the initial confrontation along with 2 of his men, and word had reached Sheriff Calloway through a network of ranchers and cattlemen that Crane's gang had been spotted working their way south through the territory, stealing horses and cattle from isolated homesteads and driving them across the border to sell to less scrupulous buyers. Perry learned of this from Sheriff Calloway himself, who rode out to the homestead on a hot, dusty afternoon with grim news written plain across his weathered face. Crane's men were seen not 15 miles north of here 2 days past, Calloway said, remaining mounted as he spoke, his hat pushed back from his forehead. They took a dozen horses off the Prescott place and left the family lucky to be alive. I do not like to alarm you, Perry, but given what happened with your brother, I thought you deserved fair warning. A man like Crane does not forget a fight he lost, and you and your brother cost him men and horses both when you fought him off. There is a chance, however small, that he might come looking to settle that score, particularly now that word has spread you have taken up your brother's claim. Perry felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, not for himself, for he had faced Crane's gang once already and survived it, but for the vulnerability of the town and more sharply and immediately for Hazel, alone and unprotected in a boarding house with an aging widow for company. "What do you recommend, Sheriff?" Perry asked. "Keep your rifle loaded and close at hand," Calloway said. "I am sending word to the territorial marshal, and I am organizing what men I can from among the ranchers hereabouts to ride patrol along the northern approaches. But I will tell you plain, son, we are a small town with a small budget for such things, and Crane's gang numbers no fewer than 6 men, by last count. If they do come this way, we will need every capable hand willing to stand and fight." That evening, Perry rode into town earlier than his custom, arriving at Abigail Coyle's yellow house just as the sun was beginning its descent, and he found Hazel in the garden once more, this time gathering the last of the season's early peas into a wicker basket, her sleeves rolled up and a smear of dirt across one cheek that Perry found, despite the gravity of his errand, unaccountably endearing. "Perry," Hazel said, straightening and shading her eyes against the low sun, "this is an unexpected visit. Is something wrong?" "I need to speak with you," Perry said, "and with Widow Coyle too, if she will hear it. There is trouble that may be coming this way, and I would have you both prepared for it." He told them then of Silas Crane, of the ambush that had killed Thomas, of the sheriff's warning that afternoon, and he watched Hazel's face grow pale beneath its light sunburn as she absorbed this news, watched her hand tighten around the handle of her basket until her knuckles whitened. "The same men who killed Thomas," she said quietly. "The same," Perry confirmed. "I do not say this to frighten you needlessly, but I would rather you know the truth of the danger than be caught unaware by it. I have spoken with Sheriff Calloway. He is organizing what defense the town can muster. I mean to ride patrol myself, along with several other ranchers, until this threat has passed or been dealt with." "You mean to fight them again," Hazel said, and there was fear in her voice now, sharp and unmistakable, fear that Perry recognized with a small, guilty leap of his heart as fear for him specifically, not merely for the general safety of the town. "If it comes to that," Perry said carefully, "yes. I will not sit idle in my brother's house while a gang of thieves and murderers threatens the town where you live, Hazel. I could not live with myself if I did." "You could be killed," Hazel said, setting down her basket and stepping closer to him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Just as Thomas was killed. I could not bear it, Perry, to lose the both of you to the very same men." The admission hung between them in the warm evening air, more honest and more revealing than either of them had intended, and Perry felt his heart pound hard against his ribs at the raw feeling in her voice, at the fact that she had, without quite meaning to, admitted that his loss would wound her every bit as deeply as Thomas's had. "Hazel," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand, the first time he had done so with any deliberate intention beyond the ordinary courtesies of a dance or a walk home. "I do not intend to be careless with my life. I have too much to live for now to throw it away needlessly." He hesitated, And then, because the danger pressing in around them seemed suddenly to strip away all the careful patience he had been practicing for weeks, he continued, "I have come to care for you, Hazel, more deeply than I believe is proper given all that has passed between our families. I have fought against admitting it, out of respect for Thomas's memory, but I find I cannot fight it any longer, not with this danger hanging over us. I would rather speak the truth now than leave it unsaid, and risk never having the chance." Hazel's breath caught, and for a long moment she said nothing, only looked up at him with an expression that mingled joy and guilt and fear all together into something Perry could not quite read. "I have felt the same," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have told myself for weeks that it was wrong, that it dishonored Thomas's memory to feel such things for his own brother so soon after his death. But I cannot deny it any longer either, Perry. I care for you. I have come to care for you a great deal." Abigail Coyle, who had been standing quietly in the doorway of her house through this entire exchange, cleared her throat gently to announce her presence, and both Perry and Hazel turned toward her with faces flushed with embarrassment at having been overheard in so private a moment. "Forgive an old woman's interference," Abigail said, "but I have watched the two of you circling one another these past 2 months like a pair of shy colts, and I will say this plainly, since it seems neither of you is willing to say it for yourselves without prompting. Thomas Yates was a fine man, and I grieved his loss along with the rest of this town. But he is gone, and you too are not, and there is no dishonor in the living finding comfort and love with one another, provided it is done with respect and with time enough to be certain of one's own heart. I believe Thomas himself, knowing the kind of man he was, would rather see the two people he loved find happiness together than watch you both wither away in guilt and loneliness for the rest of your days." There was a wisdom in the widow's words that settled something in both Perry and Hazel, a permission neither of them had quite known they needed to hear spoken aloud by someone outside their own tangled hearts. "I would not rush you," Perry said to Hazel, still holding her hand. "I would court you properly in whatever time we have, and let whatever grows between us grow at its own honest pace. But I wanted you to know the truth of my heart, especially now, with danger perhaps coming our way. I could not ride out on patrol tonight with such a thing left unsaid between us." "Then do not leave it unsaid," Hazel replied, stepping closer still, close enough that Perry could see the small flecks of gold within the green of her eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her. "Court me, Perry Yates, properly and honestly, and for as long as it takes for both our hearts to be certain. I find I would like that very much." He did not kiss her that evening, though the temptation sat heavy and sweet in the air between them, for both of them understood, without needing to speak it, that such a thing ought to wait for a moment less shadowed by fear and grief, a moment that belonged wholly to the joy of new love rather than being tangled up with danger and old sorrow. Instead, Perry simply lifted her hand and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender and so old-fashioned that Hazel felt it in her chest for hours afterward, long after Perry had ridden back out toward the homestead beneath a darkening sky. The following days passed in a tense and watchful rhythm. Sheriff Calloway organized nightly patrols along the northern and eastern approaches to town, with Perry riding alongside 4 other ranchers, including old Ezra Hendricks and his 2 grown sons, taking turns through the dark hours watching the horizon for any sign of Crane's gang. Word came from a passing drover that Crane had indeed been spotted moving south, closer now, perhaps no more than 2 days' ride from Larkspur Creek, and the whole town settled into an uneasy vigilance, women keeping rifles loaded near their kitchen doors, children kept closer to home than usual, the saloon quieter in the evenings as men saved their energy for watch duty rather than drink. Hazel found herself unable to sleep properly during those tense nights, lying awake in her narrow bed listening for hoofbeats, praying silently that whatever came riding down the main street of Larkspur Creek in the darkness would not be Silas Crane's gang, And beneath that fear, a deeper and more specific prayer that Perry Yates would return safely from each night's patrol. It was on the fourth night of heightened vigilance, a moonless night thick with the smell of coming rain, that trouble finally arrived. Perry was riding the eastern approach alongside young Caleb Hendricks when they spotted movement along the ridge line to the north, shapes darker than the surrounding darkness, moving with the deliberate quiet of men who did not wish to be seen. Perry's heart hammered as he counted the shapes, 6 riders, moving in a wide arc that would bring them down toward the edge of town from the northeast, likely aiming for the stock pens behind the livery stable where the town kept its finest breeding horses. "Ride for the sheriff," Perry whispered urgently to Caleb. "Tell him Crane is coming from the northeast, 6 riders moving toward the livery. I will try to slow them and draw their attention while you fetch help." "That is madness, Perry. You cannot face 6 men alone," Caleb protested. "I do not intend to face them," Perry said grimly. "I intend to make enough noise to warn the town and buy time for the sheriff to gather men. Go, Caleb, quickly now." Caleb wheeled his horse and galloped hard toward town, while Perry moved his own mount into a stand of cottonwoods that gave him some cover, drawing his rifle from its scabbard and watching the approaching riders with his heart pounding in his throat. He recognized Silas Crane even in the darkness, by the distinctive pale gray hat the man wore, and the way he sat his horse with a kind of arrogant looseness that spoke of a man who had rarely faced consequences for his actions. Perry waited until the riders were within perhaps 200 yards of the livery stable, close enough that a warning shot would surely be heard through the whole of town, and then he fired once into the air, the sound cracking sharp and loud across the prairie darkness. The effect was immediate. The 6 riders pulled up short, and Perry heard Crane's voice cursing loudly, calling out for whoever had fired to show themselves like a man rather than skulking in the trees like a coward. "This is Perry Yates," Perry called back, his voice steadier than he felt, his rifle raised and ready though he prayed he would not need to use it. "You killed my brother on the trail from Cheyenne, Crane, and I do not intend to let you take anything more from this town. The sheriff and half a dozen armed men are already riding this way. You would do well to turn around now while you still can." There was a tense silence, broken only by the shifting and snorting of horses, and then Crane's voice came back through the darkness, cold and dangerous. "Yates, I remember you. Your brother cost me 2 good men and a fair number of horses that day. I have been looking forward to settling that account." "Then come and try," Perry said, though every fiber of his being screamed at him that this was folly, that 6 armed men could overwhelm him in moments if they chose to press the attack. But he had committed himself to this course, to buying time for the town, and he would not back down now. What happened next occurred with the chaotic speed that Perry would later find difficult to fully recall in proper sequence. Crane gave a shouted order, and his men spurred their horses forward, some toward Perry's position among the cottonwoods, others continuing on toward the livery stable, clearly intent on grabbing what horses they could before any true resistance could be organized. Perry fired his rifle again, this time aimed low and wide of the charging riders, not wishing to kill a man if it could be avoided, but hoping to spook their horses and buy precious seconds. It worked well enough to send 2 of the riders' mounts rearing and bolting sideways, throwing their confidence into disarray, but a 3rd rider, one of Crane's men, managed to fire back in Perry's direction, and Perry felt a searing line of pain open across his upper arm as the bullet grazed him, tearing through his shirt sleeve and the flesh beneath. He bit down hard against the pain and kept his rifle steady, firing once more, and this time his shot found its mark in a horse's flank rather than its rider, sending the animal screaming and bucking its rider off into the dust. In the confusion, Perry heard the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats from the direction of town, and moments later Sheriff Calloway and 6 armed ranchers came galloping into the fray, rifles blazing warning shots into the air and shouting for Crane's gang to stand down. faced with an organized and armed defense far greater than they had anticipated, and having already lost the element of surprise, Crane and his remaining men wheeled their horses and fled back into the darkness of the northern plains, abandoning their unhorsed companion, who was quickly captured and disarmed by Ezra Hendricks and his sons. It was over in a matter of minutes, though it felt to Perry like it had stretched across an eternity, and it was only as the adrenaline began to drain from his body that he became fully aware of the burning pain in his arm and the warm wetness of blood soaking through his sleeve. "You are hit," Sheriff Calloway said, riding up beside him with concern plain on his weathered face. "How bad is it, son?" "Just a graze, I believe," Perry said, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears, and the world had begun to tilt strangely at the edges. "I will be fine, Sheriff, once it is bound properly." Word of the attack and its outcome spread through Larkspur Creek within the hour, carried by the very ranchers and townsfolk who had ridden out to repel it, and by the time Perry was helped down from his horse in front of Dr. Whitfield's small clinic on Main Street, a considerable crowd had gathered, drawn by both concern and the particular curiosity that follows any brush with danger in a small frontier town. Hazel Hurst was among that crowd, having been woken by Abigail Coyle at the first sound of gunfire, and rushed down to the clinic the moment word reached the boarding house that there had been an attack and that men were wounded. When she saw Perry being helped from his horse, his shirt sleeve dark and wet with blood, his face pale beneath the lantern light, something in her chest seized so violently that she nearly cried out. "Perry," she gasped, pushing through the small crowd to reach him, her hands immediately going to his uninjured arm as if to steady him, though he was already being supported by Sheriff Calloway on his other side. "Perry, are you badly hurt?" "A graze, nothing more," Perry said, managing a weak but genuine smile despite the pain, comforted beyond measure by the sight of her, by the fierce concern written so plainly across her face. "I promise you, Hazel, I am not so easily felled as that." Dr. Whitfield, a competent and no-nonsense man who had tended gunshot wounds and broken bones across 2 decades of frontier practice, examined the wound in his cramped little clinic, while Hazel hovered anxiously nearby, unwilling to be sent away despite the doctor's gentle suggestion that she might wait in the front room. "It is as he says," Dr. Whitfield confirmed after cleaning and examining the injury. "A graze deep enough to need stitching and a proper dressing, but it has missed the bone and any major vessel entirely. He will carry a scar, and the arm will be sore and stiff for some weeks, but there is no lasting harm done. He is a fortunate young man." Hazel let out a breath she felt she had been holding for the better part of an hour, and when Dr. Whitfield stepped out briefly to fetch clean bandages, she moved close to Perry's side and took his uninjured hand in both of hers, pressing it to her lips in a gesture that mirrored the tender kiss he had given her knuckles days before. "I told you I could not bear to lose you," Hazel said, her voice thick with emotion. "When I saw you brought in like that, bleeding, I understood in that moment just how deeply I have come to love you, Perry Yates. Not merely care for you as a friend in shared grief, but love you, truly and completely, the way a woman loves the man she wishes to build her whole life alongside." Perry's heart swelled so full in his chest that he thought it might break from the sheer weight of joy contained within it, joy made all the sweeter for having been born out of such danger and fear. "I love you too, Hazel," he said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion both. "I have loved you, I believe, since that very first evening at the Founders' Dance, though I was too cautious and too burdened by guilt to say it plainly until tonight forced my hand. I do not wish to wait any longer to build that life together if you will have me." "I will have you," Hazel said, tears now falling freely down her cheeks, though they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I will have you gladly, Perry Yates, for as long as we both shall live." Silas Crane and his remaining gang members did not return to trouble Larkspur Creek again. The captured outlaw, faced with the choice of hanging or informing, gave up enough information about Crane's usual haunts and associates that the territorial marshal was able to track down and arrest the remainder of the gang some 3 weeks later in a small settlement near the Nebraska border, bringing a measure of justice, if not full closure, to the grief that Thomas Yates' death had caused. Perry took some comfort in this news when it reached Larkspur Creek by way of a traveling telegraph operator, though he understood that no arrest could truly undo the loss the family had suffered, could only ensure that Crane's particular brand of violence would trouble no other families in the manner it had troubled his own. The town of Larkspur Creek, meanwhile, seemed to embrace the budding romance between Perry Yates and Hazel Hurst with the particular warmth that small frontier communities reserve for stories of love found amid hardship. There was no scandal attached to their courtship in the eyes of most townsfolk, for everyone had witnessed the genuine grief both had carried for Thomas, and everyone understood, in that practical frontier way of viewing life and death and the necessary business of moving forward, that there was no dishonor in two grieving hearts finding comfort and eventually love in one another's company. Their courtship, once properly declared, proceeded with a tenderness and a patience that both Perry and Hazel felt was owed not only to themselves, but to Thomas's memory as well. Perry called on Hazel twice weekly at Abigail Coyle's house, bringing small gifts, a bundle of wildflowers gathered along the creek, a jar of honey traded from a neighboring beekeeper, once a small carved wooden bird that he had whittled himself during the long, sleepless nights of standing patrol against further threats from outlaws, though none ever came again. They walked together along the creek in the long golden evenings of that Wyoming summer, and they talked, endlessly it seemed, about everything and nothing, about their childhoods and their hopes and their fears, building between them the kind of deep and genuine understanding that Hazel realized she had never quite achieved even in her letters with Thomas, however sincere and warm those letters had been. She visited Thomas's grave every Sunday still, and Perry always accompanied her, and in time their visits there became less about raw grief and more about a kind of grateful remembrance, an acknowledgment of the man whose kindness and courage had, in the strangest and most roundabout way imaginable, brought the two of them together. Hazel would often speak to the grave directly, telling Thomas of the small happenings of her week, and once, some 4 months after his death, she told him plainly of her love for his brother. "I hope you do not think ill of me, Thomas," she said one Sunday afternoon, kneeling to lay fresh black-eyed Susans against the simple wooden marker that would, in time, be replaced with a proper stone, once Perry had saved enough from the harvest. "I loved you, in the small way that letters and 11 days together can build love, and I will always be grateful for the kindness in your words and the hope you gave me when I had nowhere else to turn. But I have found a deeper love with your brother, and I believe, knowing what little I came to know of your character, that you would wish us happiness rather than guilt over what has grown between us." Perry, standing beside her with his hat in his hands, added his own quiet words. "I miss you every day, brother. I think of you each time I walk this land you cleared and this house you built with your own hands. I promise you I will care for it, and for her with everything I have. I hope, wherever you are, that you can find some peace in knowing that your kindness did not end with your death, but rather planted something that continues to grow." The wedding took place in early October, when the cottonwoods along the creek had turned to brilliant gold, and the air carried the first crisp edge of the coming winter, in the same small clapboard church on the hill where Hazel's wedding to Thomas had originally been scheduled to take place some 6 months before. Reverend Elijah Marsh, who had presided over Thomas's funeral with such gentle compassion, now presided over Perry and Hazel's wedding with evident joy, remarking in his opening words to the gathered congregation that he had rarely in his years of ministry witnessed a love story that so beautifully demonstrated how grief and joy could be woven together into something whole and holy. Hazel wore a dress of ivory silk that Abigail Coyle had helped her sew over the preceding months. Simple but elegant, with small embroidered flowers along the hem that echoed the wildflowers she had carried to Thomas's grave so many Sundays running. Her hair was arranged with more care than she had managed at the Founders' Dance, pinned up beneath a small veil that had belonged to Abigail's own late mother, lent for the occasion with tears of happiness in the old widow's eyes. Perry stood at the front of the small church in a new dark suit purchased with money saved from the summer's successful harvest, his gray eyes bright with an emotion he made no effort to hide as he watched Hazel walk down the short aisle toward him, escorted, in a gesture that brought tears to nearly every eye in the congregation, by Sheriff Wade Calloway, who had grown fond of the young woman over the preceding months and had offered, when he learned she had no father or brother to give her away, to stand in that role himself. The whole of Larkspur Creek seemed to have turned out for the ceremony, filling the small church to overflowing and spilling out onto the churchyard grass, for there were few things a frontier community loved more than a wedding, and fewer still that carried the particular sweetness of a love story that had risen from such sorrow into such genuine happiness. "Do you, Perry Yates, take this woman, Hazel Hurst, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Marsh intoned. "To have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Perry said, his voice steady and sure despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "And I promise you, Hazel, that I will spend every day of my life proving myself worthy of this love we have found together. Do you, Hazel Hurst, take this man, Perry Yates, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the Reverend continued. "To have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Hazel said, tears of joy slipping freely down her cheeks now. "With my whole heart, Perry, for the rest of my days." When Reverend Marsh pronounced them husband and wife, and invited Perry to kiss his bride, the church erupted in applause and cheerful shouting, and Perry drew Hazel close and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of everything they had endured together to arrive at this moment, the grief and the fear and the slow, patient building of trust and love. And Hazel felt in that kiss the final settling of a heart that had spent so many months uncertain and grieving, finally finding its true and permanent home. They held the wedding celebration in the same barn behind the Grange Hall, where the Founders' Dance had first revealed the growing feelings between them, with the same fiddler playing lively reels late into the October evening. And Perry and Hazel danced the first dance together, as husband and wife beneath lantern lights strung between the rafters, surrounded by the good wishes of a town that had watched their love story unfold with genuine affection, and had claimed some small ownership of its happy ending, as small frontier towns are wont to do with matters of the heart. Abigail Coyle wept happy tears throughout the entire celebration, declaring to anyone who would listen that she had known, from that very first evening when Perry rode into town with his brother's coffin, that something meaningful would come of this sorrowful beginning, though in truth she had said no such thing at the time, and had, like everyone else, simply hoped for the best amid great tragedy. They made their home together at the homestead Thomas had built, the very house and land that had once been intended for Hazel's arrival as a different man's bride. And there was, in the early days of their marriage, a certain tender complexity to living in rooms that Thomas had built with his own hands, sleeping in a bed frame he had constructed, cooking upon a stove he had purchased and hauled from Cheyenne at considerable expense. But rather than feeling haunted by these reminders, Perry and Hazel found instead a kind of comfort in them, a sense that Thomas's spirit of hope and hard work and generous love continued to live within the walls of the home he had built, now filled with a different but no less genuine love than the one he had originally hoped to find there. Perry worked the land with a dedication that honored his brother's original vision, expanding the cattle herd gradually over the following years, building a proper barn to replace the small shed Thomas had first erected, and adding a second room to the house when the family's needs eventually required it. Hazel, for her part, transformed the modest farmhouse into a true home, planting a garden each spring that grew more abundant with every passing year, hanging curtains she sewed herself, filling the rooms with the particular warmth that comes from a household built on genuine love and mutual respect. Their first child, a son, was born in the late summer of the following year, nearly exactly 1 year after Perry had first ridden into Larkspur Creek with his brother's Coffin strapped to his horse. They named him Thomas, in honor of the man whose kindness and sacrifice had, in the end, brought his brother and his intended bride together in a love neither of them could have anticipated when tragedy first struck. Young Thomas Yates grew up strong and healthy on that homestead, with his father's steady gray eyes and his mother's ready laughter, and he was told, from an early age, the story of the uncle for whom he was named, a man of great courage and kindness whose final act of love had set in motion the very family that raised him. 2 years after young Thomas's birth, Hazel gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Abigail, after the widow who had taken Hazel in during her darkest hour and had proven over the years to be as dear and constant a friend as any blood relation could have been. Abigail Coyle, upon learning of this honor, wept for the better part of an afternoon and declared the child, only half in jest, to be the finest gift she had received in all her long years in Larkspur Creek. More children followed in the years that came after. A second son they named Wade after the sheriff who had stood by them through their darkest and most dangerous days, and finally a third daughter, whom they named simply Grace, for that was what both Perry and Hazel felt had guided them through the tangled sorrow and hope of their first year together, a grace they could not have earned or planned for, but which had found them nonetheless amid tragedy and had grown, patiently and honestly, into the deepest love either of them had ever known. Thomas Yates' grave on the hillside above the creek was never neglected in all the years that followed. Perry eventually replaced the simple wooden marker with a proper granite headstone, purchased with money saved across several successful harvests, engraved with Thomas's name and dates, and a simple inscription that read, "Beloved brother, whose courage and kindness gave others the gift of love." Every Sunday, without fail, the whole Yates family would walk up that hillside together, Perry and Hazel and their growing brood of children, to lay fresh flowers against the stone and to speak, as they always had, of gratitude rather than only sorrow, of a life cut short but whose influence had rippled outward in ways Thomas himself could never have imagined when he first wrote that careful, hopeful letter to a young woman in Ohio he had never met. Larkspur Creek grew alongside the Yates family in those years, as frontier towns did, adding a proper schoolhouse where young Thomas and his siblings would eventually learn their letters, a second church to accommodate the growing congregation, a proper hotel to replace the informal boarding arrangements of earlier days, though Abigail Coyle continued taking in the occasional boarder well into her 70s, declaring that the company kept her young. Sheriff Wade Calloway served the town faithfully for another decade, before retiring to a small parcel of land not far from the Yates homestead, where he took particular pleasure in teaching young Thomas and later Wade Yates the finer points of horsemanship and fair dealing, having grown to love the family nearly as much as if they had been his own blood relations, given the role he had played in giving Hazel away at her wedding, and the many small kindnesses exchanged between the families across the years. Perry Yates, in time, became one of the most respected ranchers in that stretch of Wyoming Territory, known throughout the region for the quality of his cattle and the honesty of his dealings, a reputation he attributed always, when asked, to the example his brother Thomas had set before his untimely death. He never forgot the desperate ride into Larkspur Creek, with a coffin strapped to his horse and his brother's dying wish echoing in his mind, never forgot the terrible weight of delivering such news to a woman he had never met, and he counted it, in the end, as the strangest and most profound blessing of his life that such sorrow had led him, eventually, to the deepest happiness he had ever known. Hazel Hurst Yates lived out her days on that homestead beside the man she had come to love so completely, watching her children grow and eventually marry, and build homes of their own across the expanding territory, watching the wild and untamed land around Larkspur Creek slowly give way to fenced fields and established roads, and the steady march of progress that transformed the frontier, in the passing decades, into something more settled and secure. She never forgot Thomas Yates, never stopped being grateful for the brief but genuine hope he had offered her when she had nowhere else in the world to turn. But she came to understand, with the wisdom that only years and genuine happiness can provide, that love was not a finite thing to be spent once and never found again, but rather something that could grow, unexpected and unbidden, even from the deepest sorrow, if only two hearts remained open enough to recognize it when it arrived. On quiet evenings in their later years, when their children had grown and scattered, and it was only the two of them once more in the farmhouse Thomas had built so long before, Perry would sometimes take Hazel's weathered hand in his own and remind her of that terrible and strange first day, when he had ridden into Larkspur Creek with grief etched into every line of his face, and her name breaking from his lips like the only prayer he knew how to say. "I did not know that day," he would tell her, "riding into this town with such terrible news to deliver, that I was riding toward the greatest happiness of my life. I only knew I owed my brother a promise, and I meant to keep it." "You kept it," Hazel would answer every time with the same certainty and the same deep contentment. "You kept every promise, Perry Yates, and gave me far more besides than either of us could have imagined on that terrible day. Thomas gave us both a gift in the end, even in his dying. He gave us each other." And there, in that small farmhouse beside the creek that bore his brother's name in the memory of the town, surrounded by the family they had built together from such an unlikely and sorrowful beginning, Perry Yates and Hazel Hurst lived out the whole of their long and happy lives, bound together by grief that had, through patience and honesty and the particular grace of the wide Wyoming sky, transformed itself entirely into love.